If you're watching this, you're probably looking for a lower parts kit to finish your stripped AR-15 lower receiver. Now there's a ton of lower parts kits out there, and they all do about the same thing, but our lower parts kit, the T.REX Arms lower parts kit, is gonna offer you something a little bit different. Now this kit is obviously very small. It's a stripped lower parts kit, as in being this is just the guts of the lower receiver, so there's still quite a bit of parts you're gonna need to finish out your lower receiver, and that was kind of the intention behind this. So if you're someone like me, you're very particular in what you want with your gun. You don't want to buy a lower parts kit that has a bunch of stuff in it and you're gonna have to end up changing those parts out. If you look at the back of the packaging, we have all of the parts in the lower parts kit listed out. So we have our safety, we have our magazine catch, the spring for the magazine release, the magazine button itself, we have our bolt catch, we have the plunger and the spring for the bolt catch, and we have the roll pin for it. We have our buffer retainer, pin and spring. We have our 2 takedown pins, our springs for each, springs for each, detents for those, and then we have our detent and spring for our safety. So we have all of the guts for our lower parts kit right there. With this lower parts kit being just the guts of the lower receiver, we get to be a little bit more particular with the other parts that we want to put into our lower that aren't included in this lower parts kit. So obviously we need our lower receiver, we need a trigger guard. In this case, we're going with a BCM, one of the ones that we sell on the website. We have just an A2 grip that I've put some skater tape on. Geisley trigger, I think this is essential for every lower, at least every lower I'm using. Bad lever, if you're into that, I really like bad levers. And then I want an A5 buffer system, so that's what I got going on here. So got a B5 stock, Filtor A5 buffer tube with a BCM end plate, castle nut, and then we have a green Sprinco rifle length spring with an A5H2 buffer weight. So that's all the parts we got. Let's go ahead and install this guy up. There are a lot of different ways that you can install these parts, and the way I like to do it is I just like to go from the front of the receiver down to the back. So I'm gonna start with the front takedown pin, and I'm actually gonna use this with minimal tools, nothing fancy. So I'm gonna just act like I don't have a bunch of fancy armor tools specific to the AR-15 platform. I'm gonna take the detent and grab some needle nose pliers that have some good grip on them. I'm going to use them to get this detent started. Now I'm going to take the pivot pin and just push it the rest of the way down. You hear it click, and it'll go in just like that. I've found that to be one of the easiest ways to put this pivot pin in. This is generally the hardest part of the lower receiver to install. We're going to go ahead and do the magazine release, magazine button next. Pretty simple. Just drop this guy in there, drop the spring in, take your button. You can generally get this started with just your fingers. I highly recommend doing that. So we got it started. Now you can take a pen or really anything and push the magazine button through and then just continue to tighten this guy up. So how you know you've threaded this on far enough is the magazine catch won't be protruding through the button, and you won't have any exposed female threads. So you can adjust this by going 1 thread deeper or 1 thread less. If you want the button to be less exposed or more exposed, it won't really affect all that much. So now we're gonna do the bolt catch, and we're gonna start the receiver back to where it was. Again, there's a lot of different ways you can do this, but I'm actually going to start this in a similar fashion comparatively to the front pivot pin, taking my needle nose pliers, getting that roll pin secured in there, and all I wanna do is get this guy started. So I can literally just start this with the hammer directly. Now that it's started and I just don't need my pliers anymore, I can get it going just a little bit more with a fatter punch, just like that. And then I can go ahead and take this little guy right here. Looks like, we're gonna call it a plunger, and there's a spring that fits over it perfectly. Now, if you have a lower parts kit that includes a fire control group, this spring is very similar to the spring that goes under the disconnect on your trigger. If you do mix them up, it will work, but you just probably gonna have some trigger issues later on. So go ahead and push that guy through the hole. Pop that in there just like this. Now, there's a little bit of a technique to do to this. So I'm gonna use my ring finger, take my thumb and index finger to hold the punch. Just tap it on in. And sometimes, like this, if you slightly miss it, this will be kind of stuck. That's okay, just wiggle it around and it'll catch in there right where it needs to go. So now the pivot, or the roll pin is actually captured the bolt catch, and then we can just finish it off. Once it's about as low as it can go with that fat punch, if I keep hitting them with a fast punch, I'll get some marring on the low receiver, so I'm gonna go to a smaller punch. Actually, I'll go with this one, just to finish it off. And get that roll pin nice and flush. Just like that. All right. So like I said, we're gonna go front to back. Again, there's not really, I'm sure there is a specific order that's recommended, but this is just what I do. Go ahead and drop the trigger in there. In this case, it's the guidely trigger. There we go. Once we got the bottom half of the trigger in, we're gonna do the trigger hammer. There's a little trick to this. What I'm gonna do is I'm going to lay the springs down, pivot the trigger. I'm actually gonna pull it back so it catches on the disconnect. You'll hear it click and it's in there. So generally this is one of the more difficult things to install for people, but if you pull that trigger back, it will click in place. Now just be careful you don't hit the trigger because it will fly out. Now I'll take the other trigger pin and I'm going to control this just so it doesn't fly out. And all I gotta do is push the front of this trigger hammer down, and then this guy just slide on through. Just like so. All right. We can function check the trigger now. All good to go. Up next is the trigger guard. Now, depending on the kind of trigger guard you have, may vary on how you install this. This is just the BCM Polar one that we sell. So with no screws or roll pin in there, we're just gonna drop it onto the lower receiver. And then the front of the trigger guard is actually a threaded screw. So we'll just go ahead and screw that guy in. Now we're gonna do the most dangerous part of the lower receiver, and that is the roll pin for the trigger guard on the back of the lower receiver. So if you start tapping this roll pin in and these leaves on the lower receiver are not supported, they can break off. And in fact, they probably will. So just be very careful. You can use a bench block, you can use something. It doesn't necessarily have to be a bench block. Just make sure that they are supported. I like the bench block because there's a bunch of holes here and I can just go ahead and tap that in just like that, and it's nice and supported. So nothing fancy here. I'm literally just gonna use my fingers to get it started. Make sure it's supported. So as I'm tapping it, I'm ensuring that both sides of these leaves are touching the bench block. And then I'll just want to flush this guy up. This bench block is not the most ideal candidate for this sort of job because the lower receiver is not all that well balanced, but make it work. So we just want to make sure that roll pin is slightly past the leaf on both sides. We don't want it sticking out either side. But honestly, if it is flush on one side, that'll be fine. The trigger guard's not going to fall out. Now we're going to install the unique part about this low receiver, and that is the safety. So what I like to do is actually flip this guy upside down. Go ahead and put my safety in. Then I can just drop the safety detent in. This is the one that's very pointy. It's larger than the other two that are in the kit. Just fall right down in there. Now the difference between the springs for the pivot pins and the safety, you can tell is the length. You'll have two that are long and skinny, and then you have a shorter one that's a little bit fatter. That's gonna be your safety. Also, the shorter, fatter one won't fit in the holes for the pivot pins, takedown pins. So, got the pin in there. I can literally just put the safety there, use my grip to guide it, and just put her on there, and you're good to go. So this screw can get a little bit annoying to install in here. You just kind of finesse it in there. The flatheads are much more annoying than the Allen key ones. The Allen key ones you can actually just stick on a tool and it'll stick to it, and then you can guide it in there. This one you kind of got to use your fingers. So. If you're wondering how tight you need to go on the screw, first off, if you're screwing it in and you feel any sort of resistance, you're probably cross-threading. Back out and start over. If you do start to cross-thread it too far, most lower receivers can thread this way as well through the trigger guard, or through where your trigger is. Take the trigger out, thread the screw the other way, and it'll retract the threads. But once you get it on there, once you meet the resistance after it goes all the way in, just give it like another quarter to half a turn and you'll be fine. Now, we get to install the Ambi part of the safety. So this is what the safety will look like if you don't want the Ambi on there. You'll just have an empty screw hole. Totally fine. It is completely slick. There's no catch there. So again, if you don't want the Ambi, you can just take it off and leave it that way. But if you do want the Ambi, slide it on there, screw in. You can add Loctite if you want. I've never put Loctite on these. They've never come off. You can actually torque these on pretty good. So that's exactly what we're going to do. Just like that. And the reason why I like Ambi safeties is obviously flick the fire with your thumb and I can go back to safe without breaking my grip. And as you can see, this safety is very, very clicky on either side. So our rear takedown pin, you want the grooves to be orientated back towards the back of the lower receiver. Just slide her in there just like that. Take your detent, slide it in that little hole there. What I like to do is I take the spring, just push it in there, make sure it's actually caught, and then I take this back out. Now you can take your buffer retaining pin and drop it in there for now, which is fine, and you just let it sit there. Now we're going to take our buffer tube. I recommend putting the stock on the buffer tube now. It just makes threading it on a little bit easier. Go ahead and thread your castle nut all the way on as far as it'll go. Slide your end plate on as well as far as it'll go. And then all you're doing is threading this guy on. So I'm going to thread this until I start to hit that buffer retaining pin. Once I hit it, I need to push the buffer retaining pin down, give it one more turn, and that's as far as it needs to go. So now we still have to put the takedown pin spring in. So the buffer tube's threaded all the way on, and obviously this spring can't get in there. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the buffer tube slightly so I can fit this guy in there. Once it goes in there, now all I'm going to do is use something. I just use my thumbnail to push the spring in so I can turn the buffer tube back. And the key here is making sure that spring is straight. So when I push the end plate down, the spring doesn't get bent underneath this end plate. And once that's on there, I'm going to just use my fingers to thread the castle nut on. There you have it. Now we just got to torque that down and stake it. As we torque down this castle nut onto the lower receiver, the stock's going to want to rotate. So we just want to make sure we have something keeping the stock straight. So as we tighten it, you don't have a crooked stock on your lower. So the way I like to do this is I'm actually going to take the tool, whatever the tool you're using is, to tighten down the castle nut. This is just a BCM tool, and I'm actually not going to attach it to anything. I'm just going to use my fingers here, and I'm going to just keep an eye on the stock in regards to the pistol grip, and just make sure that as I slightly tighten this, that nothing is rotating. So I'm just going to go as tight as I can with my hands and call that good for now. Now I will get my breaker bar, or you can use a torque wrench and go to the specified torque spec. I'm just going to crank on it. I'm going to put my upper body into this, lean into the buffer tube so it won't rotate, and give it a little ugga-dugga, and she'll be good to go. And she is nice and straight. Now for staking it, you're going to need an actual stake punch. And the way I like to do this, there's people that are really good at staking and they take a lot of pride in their stakes. I'm not one of those people. This is just an AR-15 lower receiver. But what I like to do is just make sure she's centered up, give it a little tap to get it started. That's a little bit closer to the edge than I would want. So I'm going to redirect the stake towards the lower. So whichever direction you want this hole to go, just point your stake towards it, or in the opposite direction, just like that. So we got it pushed back a little bit. Now I can stake down, and this should be a good looking stake. That is beautiful. That is one of the best stakes I've ever done. Now that we got that guy staked down, go ahead and throw your buffer and buffer spring in there. Should just slide right in. And then if you have a bad lever, go ahead and throw that guy on. There you have it, guys. That is the T.REX Arms lower parts kit, how to install it. If you guys have any questions regarding the lower parts kit, how to install it, anything at all, go ahead and email us at team@trex-arms.com.